Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on love, particularly through the theoretical lens of attachment theory. We're going to talk about attachment theory as a lifelong concept and construct. And attachment theory, we're going to get into the meat of this in a minute, but this is a theory that is trying to explain how human beings connect to one another from our very first initial relationships all the way through the life cycle. So it goes from childhood into adulthood. It is a lifelong cradle to grave construct. So by the end of this, you will understand attachment styles in children and how they come to be, how those attachment styles influence adults and in the way that they form romantic relationships based on their attachment style. And we'll talk about some outstanding questions about attachment theory, such as, can it ever change? Does it ever change? And if it does, when? So, this is the order and how you can follow along today. I'm going to give you a brief background of the theory, and then we're going to talk about attachment styles, how they develop in childhood. We'll break down the four major attachment styles of adulthood. And then we're going to talk about, as theorists, how do we quantify that? How do we measure or capture or view and observe empirical data about attachment styles? And the way that we do that is through Bowlby's internal models and attachment dimensions. And lastly, we'll wrap up with attachment style stability, whether it always is the same or if it can change. Attachment theory, the original theorist is John Bowlby, and it emerged in the 1940s, post World War II. John Bowlby was brought in to look at actually a spate of juvenile delinquency, and the country was trying to understand why are these young adults, mostly boys, why are there these behavioral problems going on? And John Bowlby came to find that a lot of these young people that were having delinquency issues had been children who during World War II had been sent away from their parents for their own safety. A lot of them had lived in London, and they were sent out of the city because the city was being bombed, and that these kids, if they didn't have a family member to go to that lived elsewhere, they were placed in group homes where all their basic, Maslow's hierarchy needs were met. They were fed, they were clothed, they were warm and dry, they were as safe as they could be. But they weren't getting a lot of personal attention and care. Certainly, there was a huge lack of affection. And John Bowlby found that that is something they had in common. And that led him to create or propose attachment theory. So it is based on the belief that humans are biologically wired to connect to others. And that might be speaking to you right now, especially as we are all social distancing. Many of us are in quarantine and we are separated from other people. And I know it's certainly true for me. I am feeling that distance and that separation very keenly. Um, and attachment theory would support that. It says that the attachment patterns that we establish in early childhood persist throughout our life, and that it is a basic fundamental need of human beings to be attached to other people. And that early bonds with typically the mother or the primary caregiver parent sets the tone and sets the pattern for how we pursue relationships with others for the rest of our lives. And that initial relationship, that very first connection that we establish, typically to the mother, shapes our understanding of the world and our place in it for the rest of our lives. And so it says that the primary caregiver, which could be any adult, right? Like it doesn't have to be the mother, but traditionally speaking, they were focusing on research with babies and mothers. that caregiver served as a secure base. Now, they witnessed this in primate behavior, chimpanzees doing the exact same thing. When there is a baby and it wants to begin to explore its environment, it'll wander away a few steps from the mother, like climb down off the mother's back, take a few steps away, explore a little bit, but then after a brief time away, they will return back to the mother. Almost like in the game of tag, there is that safe spot, that the mother is the secure base, and that it's from that spot that they will go out and explore their environment, always returning back to the safety and security of mom. And we see the same exact behavioral pattern in human babies as well. Mary Ainsworth is the next most important theorist with attachment theory. She came along in the 70s and established and showed evidence, observable data, empirical data of the secure base in the 1970s. And what we came to understand is that effective parenting gives a child the sense of freedom and safety to explore the world around them, knowing that they have their caregiver as a safe and secure backup. And she created something called the strange situation experiment to demonstrate this and to show different kinds of attachment styles based on the parent-baby bond. And there's a video of that in our Blackboard course page. I encourage you to check it out. It's really cool. It shows you the strange situation experiment. And what we know is that this is a cradle to grave construct. From the moment a baby is born, this attachment style seems to influence and affect every relationship that they have from there on out until death. According to attachment theory, the kind of, if we zoom out and want to just lay the groundwork for the big takeaways, attachment theory would say that love can be conceptualized as a process of attachment, that the way that we feel love, the way that we experience love, includes forming a bond and becoming close to someone. And the way that we form that bond and the way that we understand closeness is going to be influenced by our attachment style. It is a social developmental approach. So it's saying that we learn how to love other people. And this theory stresses how interactions with others affect attachment style across the lifespan, placing special importance on that very first relationship. Children learn to develop attachments through communication with their caregivers. And that's why we are interested in this as communication scholars. This isn't strictly psychological. This isn't something that's happening only cognitively in the mind. This is something that we learn and understand through interaction, through communicating with our caregivers. And then in subsequent relationships, we learn our attachment style and how to go about forming these bonds and being close to other people. And that this sense of security, that secure base of your parent, gives us a sense of independence that's rooted in security, that we feel safe to take chances because we know we always have that safe space to return to. And as we grow out of babyhood into childhood and into adulthood, security, the idea of security changes a little bit. It's based on being self-sufficient while also having the ability to provide care and support to other people. So attachment theory is very interested in how much we are willing to rely on other people, let other people rely on us, this idea of interdependence and self-sufficiency. A couple of the big vocabulary items of this theory are, of course, attachment itself. The idea that our need to develop attachments to other people is innate, it is automatic, we are born with it, and every human has it, that it is a necessary part of human development. And part of that attachment is the secure base, keeps children in close proximity to their caregivers, protecting them from danger, and also gives them the confidence to explore their world. And we're going to touch on Bowlby's internal working models. This is how we think about relationships. So our internal working models are, how do we feel about ourselves generally, and how do we feel about others generally? They are cognitions which influence orientations towards love, intimacy, and interpersonal interaction in adult relationships. So, attachment theory says that we learn how to have a bond with another person as an infant with our primary caretaker, and that this initial relationship shapes how we are going to do relationships with everyone else for the rest of our lives. And it says that depending on how we interact with and bond with that primary caretaker, typically the mother, that will give us one of several different attachment styles. Now, initially, when this theory was strictly used as like a childhood development theory, there was only three styles. But this theory has been used so much research has been conducted. And has extended well into adulthood in various contexts. And there was a fourth attachment style added a little later down the line. So we'll cover all four here of these attachment styles that we learn from that initial primary relationship as an infant. So the first style is secure, and then we see anxious ambivalent, avoidant. This is also called anxious avoidant. And fearful. And what's important to know is that secure as a category stands alone, securely attached, and the rest are all anxiously attached in some ways. The vocabulary can change for anxious ambivalent. Sometimes it's referred to as preoccupied, but we will stick with anxious ambivalent. Anxious avoidant is sometimes called dismissive. Um, they're just two different labels for the same thing. Anxious avoidant, dismissive is the same. And so let's start with secure. Effective parenting is seen as attending to the child's needs and being consistently responsive. When the baby cries, it is picked up, it is fed, its diaper is changed, it is rocked, it's comforted. And when a baby's needs are consistently met, when a parent is responsive, this produces a secure child. And so, in terms of Mary Ainsworth's strange situation, if you haven't watched that video, I encourage you to pause here and go check that out, because that really explains these attachment styles. But what we know is if a child is securely attached, it has a sense of safety because its parent is that secure base. And so they feel like they can explore the world around them. They are happy to interact with their parents and with strangers. They see themselves as friendly and good natured and likable when they get older. They generally trust others as good intentioned. And the good news is that about 65% of the population is securely attached. Um, when caregiving is overly protective, when it is smothering, when it is discouraging of exploration or risk taking, right? Like if the secure base of the mother, if the baby starts to take a step away to explore their environment, if the mother quickly snatches them back and keeps them from exploration, this can create a child who is anxious, ambivalent. They see their environment as threatening and scary, that it is not safe to explore. And as a result, they can become very clingy and needy and require ongoing reassurance from the parent. In Mary Ainsworth's strange situation, that lab experiment has the primary caretaker playing in a room with the baby. Mom is called away. They observe what the baby does. A securely attached baby is going to be upset that mom has left. And when she comes back, the baby will be comforted by the mother. They may cry if the mom picks them up. They return to kind of stasis. They calm down. They feel comforted and okay, and they can go back to playing. An anxious, ambivalent baby, when mom leaves the room, is going to cry and be upset. But what's different here is that when mom does come back, they are still besides themselves. They cannot be comforted. And that's where the word ambivalent comes from. They were upset that she left, but they still seem upset when she comes back. And that is because, they don't trust the environment as a safe place to explore and be. And so it is much more alarming and upsetting when the mother leaves. And that's where the label anxious ambivalent comes from. That even when mom comes back, they can't be comforted. They are so upset. An anxious avoidant attachment style is where the parenting is inconsistent. Sometimes the parent is responsive, but sometimes they are unavailable or indifferent. And what this means is the child can't rely on a consistent response from their partner, that they don't trust their parent to respond to their needs. And so what we have here is a child that becomes very self-reliant. They, as an adult or a little bit older, they don't trust that the person they're in the relationship with um, is going to be reliable, and so they count on themselves. In the strange situation experiment, an anxious avoidant child, when mom leaves the room, on the outside, they don't even seem upset. They continue, they might look, they see, they notice she's gone, but they don't cry. And when mom comes back in the room, oftentimes they will ignore mom, like, oh, you're here. I didn't even notice you were gone. No big deal. But what we know is, and we're talking about little babies here, right? Pre-verbal babies. When you have a heart monitor on these babies, when you swab their cheek for stress hormones, they're a lot like ducks, where they seem smooth on the surface, really nothing's going on, but they are kicking furiously underneath. So anxious avoidant babies, they don't cry when mom leaves the room, but their heart rate is elevated. They are stressed out. They are experiencing it just as negatively as the secure and anxious ambivalent babies, but they've already learned as little babies that it's not worth their time to cry about it. That displaying that crying, they can't count on the crying getting them the results they need, so they skip it. And as adults, anxious avoidant people don't like to rely on other people. They like to rely on themselves, and they don't want other people relying too much on them, because in their experience, people are, sometimes show up for them, but sometimes don't. And so they learn not to count on that. The fourth category that was added to adult attachment is the fearful category. And this is when parenting is really disengaged. So you could be talking about a parent that's like deeply self absorbed, but you could also be talking about a parent that is consistently distractive and non-responsive to the child for other reasons. Single parents who are working, who have multiple children, people who are dealing with an illness, certainly postpartum depression, any kind of substance abuse or alcoholism really can limit a parent's ability to be responsive to that infant. Job loss, divorce, death, having to move. Like, there are a lot of reasons why a parent who loves their baby might not be super responsive to their baby if they have just a lot on their plate. And this can result in a fearful attachment style where the child is consistently not responded to. Um, and so this happens in situations of abuse, of neglect. If the parent is engaging in, dangerous behaviors, then we see fearful attachment styles emerge. And it's a very small amount of the population. We don't know actually how many people would really categorize as fearful, because people who have a fearful attachment style just don't trust other people, and they don't participate in social science research, right? Like, they're not going to take a survey or do an interview and answer all kinds of personal questions about their love life and their home life and their family and their childhood experiences, because they were bad, and they have been taught that other people are dangerous and can hurt them. And so we're making a lot of inferences about the fearful attachment style. We don't have a lot of hard facts about it, because understandably, fearful people don't want, people with a fearful attachment style don't want to participate in self-reporting about being fearful. So let's take attachment theory into adulthood, into adult romantic relationships. If we know that people develop their attachment style as an infant with their primary caregiver, we see that as people grow up and begin to, have lives of their own, become independent, that their secure base shifts from their primary caregiver to a romantic partner. And so in adulthood, the normative life pattern is for people to begin to see their romantic partner as their secure base instead of their primary caregiver. Although, I mean, for many people, uh, it's like adding a secure base rather than simply replacing. For many, that primary caregiver, that loving mother figure, whether it's a biological mother, grandmother, a father, or a mentor, like that person that really raised you, they're always going to be a form of a secure base. But what is normative is in adulthood, we, shift that to a romantic partner. And we're going to talk about how attachment styles influence the way adults do romantic relationships. These are items from one form of a measure that scholars and research scientists use to figure out people's attachment style. So this is a really well-established measure called the Adult Attachment Survey. And you can see basically people are presented with these paragraphs and they're given a Likert scale on a scale of 1 to 7. I completely agree to completely disagree. Which one do you relate to? And so you can see how they map on to the different attachment styles. I want to be completely emotionally intimate with others, but I often find that others are reluctant to get as close as I would like to be. I am uncomfortable being without close relationships, but I sometimes worry that others don't value me as much as I value them. This paragraph is describing, yes, that's right, anxious, ambivalent / preoccupied. The next one, I am comfortable without close emotional relationships. It is very important to me to feel independent and self sufficient, and I prefer not to depend on others or have others depend on me. This describes attachment style anxious avoidant or dismissive. It is easy for me to become emotionally close to others. I am comfortable depending on others and having others depend on me. I don't worry about being alone or having others not accept me. Yes, this is secure. And lastly, I am uncomfortable getting close to others. I want emotionally close relationships, but I find it difficult to trust others completely or to depend on them. I worry that I will be hurt if I allow myself to become too close to others. That is our sad, fearful. John Bowlby said that we can understand attachment in adults as being based off of internal working models. These are the cognitions of how we think about ourselves and others, and therefore the thoughts that we have surrounding intimacy, closeness, and love. And so Bowlby proposed that there are two working models that are relevant. One is our self worth, and two is our trust in others. So basically, this breaks down to be, we have an internal working model of ourself. Do we generally believe that we ourselves are good, are lovable, are deserving of love, are worthy of love, or not? Do we believe that we are not worthy of love, that we are not generally likable and lovable? And trust in others is, are other people generally um, well intentioned, or are other people generally not to be trusted and should be avoided? Now, even securely attached people could be cynical, could say, like, I'm going to keep my distance until someone proves they're trustworthy. Like, trust is something to be earned. That's a normal sentiment for any attachment style. Trust in others as an internal working model is about, are you willing to give someone the benefit of the doubt to earn that trust? Are you going to, give them an opportunity, or is the answer right off the bat no, because other people are bad? And so it's basically pretty simplistic. Are people generally good and worth a try, or are people generally bad and to be avoided being close to? How that connects to attachment styles in adulthood Basically, our internal working models of self and others is dictated by our attachment style that we learned in childhood. So, securely attached people, which again is most of the population, um, has a pro social style. So, they have a positive model of themselves, they have a positive mental model of others. Anxious, ambivalent people, sometimes also called preoccupied, have a more emotional style. So here's where this is what they've learned from their caregiver. They have a positive model of others, but a negative mental model of themselves. And so this is the baby that was besides themselves when the mom left the experiment, and couldn't be comforted when she came back. It's because anxious, ambivalent people see other people as good. They're very desirous of being close and in relationships, but they don't believe that they themselves are lovable. Oftentimes, anxious, ambivalent people believe that once their lover discovers who they truly are, they will leave them. Anxious, ambivalent people are very afraid of getting broken up with. They seek validation by being in a relationship with other people. They can be very clingy. Oftentimes, anxious, ambivalent people are the kind of more codependent people in relationships. They need a lot of affirmations, compliments, reassurances. They get very nervous about potential threats and other people because they believe that they're probably not actually worthy of that relationship themselves. And so they're very afraid that their partner will find someone better. So they can be very jealous. Um, they can be needy. They can be controlling. They're the people that are likely to be, checking their partner's phone to see who they're talking to, or very upset that their partner has, liked too many photos on Instagram of someone else, because they have a positive view of others and a negative view of self. Anxious, avoidant people, sometimes called dismissive, have a detached style. They have a positive model of themselves, but a negative view of others. Because remember, these are the babies that their caregiver was inconsistent. Sometimes they were responsive, sometimes they were not, and so the anxious avoidant person never knew what they were going to get. And so what they learned to do is rely on themselves. And so the anxious avoidant person might enjoy being in relationships with other people, but they never want to get too close. So this is the person that's going to have some emotional walls up. Anxious avoidant people can be very attractive. They can be very charming, but they don't want it to get too deep. They don't want to have to count on another person. They can be very uncomfortable with another person really relying on them. They might not want to make long-term plans. They might always keep some information, secret to themselves. Anxious avoidant people tend to be really great in a crisis. If you get a flat tire or something stressful happens at work, because they're super self-sufficient. They are used to tackling problems, figure things out for themselves. They're really self-sufficient. And so they can be really helpful in that kind of situation, but they would be less comfortable or happy to say, like, support you through a death in the family, because that's just too close, too emotional. They don't want you counting on them too much, because the anxious avoidant person assumes that eventually the relationship will end, and they are fine with that because they have me, myself, and I, positive model of self, but negative model of others. And lastly, the fearful style has a negative model of both themselves and others. They've had a consistently unresponsive caregiver. They were neglected, sometimes through no fault of the caregiver, right? Like a caregiver could love them very much, but just not have had the resources to be a good parent during that important period of life. And this results in a negative model of other people. They don't trust others to meet their needs, to be good to them, to be trustworthy, but they also don't feel that they deserve that. So they have a negative model of self. It's really tough. One area of probably mostly fearful people are adult children of narcissists. And the only reason that I say that we even know that, is because a colleague of mine spent many years building relationships with a support group for adult children of narcissists. on Facebook, actually, but it is a secret group. You have to be invited in. For obvious reasons, they don't trust other people. And so it took her many years of building relationships to gain access and to build trust with people to talk about it. And what she found was all of these adult children of narcissists, people who had been raised by narcissists, matched this fearful attachment style. So for my visual learners, this is what that looks like. It's a pretty simple breakdown, right? So if we take our two mental working models, we've got our cognitions about others and our cognitions about self. And it's super simple. Is it positive or is it negative? Positive or negative? And that results in our four attachment styles. So positive view of self, positive view of others, we have our secures. Positive view of self, but negative view of others, we have our dismissives or our anxious avoidance. Negative view of self, but positive view of others, we have our preoccupieds or anxious ambivalence. And negative view of everybody, we have our poor fearfuls. This is how the text breaks it down. And I think that this is, a really helpful little snapshot, actually. Um, Secure, preoccupied. Remember, this is preoccupied is anxious, ambivalent, dismissive, anxious, avoidant, and fearful. So secure, I'm okay, you're okay. They're self-sufficient. They're comfortable with intimacy. They want interdependent relationships. What's interesting about securely attached people is nobody likes rejection, but secures understand, hey, this relationship might not work out, but I'll be okay. I deserve love. I am worthy of love. And even if this isn't the right fit, secures are able to have heartbreak and know that, they're going to live, that they'll survive it. Whereas an anxious, ambivalent person or preoccupied person, they feel I'm not okay, but you're okay, right? They feel good about other people, but not themselves. They would take heartbreak very badly because they're overly involved and dependent on their relationship. They can't get close enough. The preoccupied person, the anxious, ambivalent person, always wants to get closer, and they feel like other people don't want to get as close as they do, that they're more into it than their partner is. And as a result, they can get very clingy. Sometimes we see anxious, ambivalent people pick fights just to see if the other person cares, if they'll engage. And so a lot of times there's this up and down, this drama with anxious ambivalence because they're always checking. They're needing constant reassurance. Are you into this? Are you into me? Am I attractive? Do you want to be with someone else? Are you going to leave me? Are you setting up your next relationship? Because they don't feel good about themselves, but they feel good about others. And so they need relationships to feel okay. If we jump down to our dismissives or our anxious avoidance, they want to avoid being close to people, right? They believe that they're okay, but that other people are not. So they are not comfortable with deep emotional intimacy. They tend to be fine with physical intimacy. And actually, we see our anxious avoidance tend to have the most one night stands of any of our signs, our different attachment styles. But anxious avoidance see relationships as fun, as a way to pass the time. A lot of times these are like the quote unquote players, but they don't see relationships as essential. So they know that they'll be fine on their own. They've always been on their own. And at the end of the day, they expect to be on their own. So actually, anxious avoidance take breakups really well because they were always expecting that to happen. Like when anxious avoidance get into relationships, they assume it's with a shelf life. They know it's only going to last for so long. And so when it does end, they're fine with that because, they assume that that's what would happen. Whereas our anxious ambivalents are devastated. And lastly, our fearfuls. We are guessing that they probably swing wildly from wanting to be close to people to wanting to run and hide from people. That they are fearful of intimacy because they really want it, but they are afraid it will hurt them. And so they see relationships as a really painful thing. So shout out to our fearfuls. We're sorry, guys. You've had it rough. Another kind of more sophisticated way of figuring out a person's attachment style is not just their internal working models of self and other. It's this other way. Another conceptualization of attachment dimensions is relational fears. Are people afraid of intimacy, or are they afraid of abandonment? Meaning, like, does getting close to someone make them feel panicky, or does being left by someone make them feel panicky? And we see our insecurely attached, our avoidant styles tend to have much higher intimacy or abandonment fears than our secures do. Here are items from as an established attachment measure that tap into those fears of abandonment and fears of intimacy. So look at these statements about relational anxiety. My desire to be very close sometimes scares people away. I worry a fair amount about losing my partner. I need a lot of reassurance that I am loved. Ooh, typo. I am loved by my partner. Whereas look at these items on relational avoidance. This is the fear of intimacy, not of the afraid of getting too close. I prefer not to show a partner how I feel deep down. I get uncomfortable when a romantic partner wants to be very close. I try to avoid getting too close to my partner. So you can see how these fears of abandonment statements at the top probably are closely associated with our anxious, ambivalent people, our preoccupieds. And these statements on the bottom probably ring true for dismissive, anxious, avoidant people. So we can actually place people in terms of their fears. Are they afraid of abandonment, or are they afraid of intimacy? And we can place people on a dimension or categorize you into a group. So look at this visual. Here you can see we can still put people into the four categories of secure. Um, Let me get my pencil. Of secure, or anxious avoidant slash dismissive, or anxious ambivalent slash preoccupied, or fearful. So just like the mental working models, we can still say, hey, you land in one of these four boxes. But what's more sophisticated about this form of measurement is that it's on a scale. It's not a yes, no, positive, negative. It's on a spectrum. So some people will be extremely low, some people will be extremely high, but some people are going to hang out somewhere in the middle, right? So on fears of abandonment at the top, our secures are going to be generally low, but we see that some secure people will have extremely low fears of abandonment. They're not afraid their partner is going to leave them. If that happens, they'll live, they'll be fine. They don't overly worry about it. They believe that they are lovable, that they are a catch, and if their partner leaves, hey, their loss. But there is a range here, right? So some secure people are going to be a little more worried about it. They might be even moderately worried about it. Like, hey, I really care about this partner. If they were to leave me, I'd be devastated. So it is something that I think about. I do worry about it. They could land up here on the range, right? And so they could be anywhere from here to here and still land in the secure box, right? So what we see is secures are generally low on fears of abandonment and fears of intimacy. Our anxious ambivalence or preoccupieds are generally very high on fears of abandonment. They are stressed out. They are always worried. They're somewhere in this range, on the higher end of the spectrum. They are going to give it a lot of thought, a lot of surveillance, a lot of worry that their partner would leave them. But looking over here on fears of intimacy, they are not afraid to get close, right? They're going to be somewhere over in this low range. They are not afraid to get close. They want to be intimate. They want to tell all their darkest secrets. They want to know everything about this other person. They will accept them for it, but they're very afraid that they'll be left. On the other hand, we see kind of the flip-flop of fears for our anxious avoidance or our dismissives. They have a low fear of abandonment, right? Like they don't care if their partner leaves. In fact, they're assuming that at some point they'll leave or their partner will leave. They don't want a long lasting relationship really, because that would involve getting too close. Instead, they have a very high fear of intimacy. This idea of like telling their darkest secret sounds awful to them, of having someone rely on them and having them rely on their partner to not be able to get through their day-to-day lives without this other person sounds terrifying and awful. So they don't mind the idea of a breakup, but they do mind the idea of becoming too close. And our fearfuls are the reason why they are called fearful is because they are high on both forms of fear. They have high fears of intimacy. They're really afraid to get close to someone because getting close to someone means that they'll hurt them. And they're also really afraid of abandonment. They're afraid to get into a relationship because if the relationship ends, they believe that their partner will leave them and that will hurt them. So we can still lump people into one of four categories, but we know that there is a range within the categories. Do secures have a positive mental model of themselves and others? Yes, but they might have a moderate fear of abandonment or a moderate fear of intimacy. What we know is secures generally have low fears of everything, and that our preoccupieds are going to have higher fears of abandonment. Our dismissives, our anxious avoidants are going to have high fears of intimacy, and our fearfuls are going to have high fears of everything. So this is a good time for you to hop out of this lecture and go check out the participation activity. I'm asking you to watch a clip from Good Will Hunting, where Skylar invites Will to move to California with her. And I want you to think about if you put on your scholar cap, what attachment style would you say, based off of what we've learned, is Skylar and Will? Are they the same? Are they different? How do these attachment styles interact with each other? And specifically, what behaviors do you think were influenced by their attachment styles? Okay, so far at this point, I probably have gone over an attachment style that you can relate to, either through the mental working models or through the relational fears. Are you afraid to get close to someone? Are you afraid that your partner is going to leave you? Are you not super fearful of either? That'll probably indicate to you if you are securely attached or anxiously attached. And if you are anxiously attached, if you're more ambivalent or dismissive or avoidant. So attachment theory is a cradle to grave construct. It is actually talked about as a personality characteristic that once we establish our attachment style in infancy, and we're talking the first few months of life, that becomes a part of who we are. And an interaction between our own temperament that we're born with and our interactions with primary caregivers at a young age sets us up for our relationships the rest of our lives. Do we see the world as a safe place and feel comfortable with intimacy with others, like a secure? Do we feel needy? Do we seek approval from others? Do we have a less positive view of ourselves, like our anxious ambivalence? Do we think that we are better off alone, believing that we can only rely on ourselves, like our anxious avoidance? Do we view others with mistrust? Um, or do we idolize other people yet see ourselves as unworthy, sometimes seeking out intense closeness and other times rejecting it completely, like we think our fearfuls do? Now, it might sound like being securely attached is best, but there are advantages to being the other types. So don't don't fret or despair if you feel like, hey, you know what? Preoccupied sounds like me. Dismissive sounds like me. There are a lot of pros to that. Now, most of the population is secure, and we think a very tiny fraction is fearful. But there is a healthy, between 15 and 20% of the population could fall into being anxious ambivalent or anxious avoidant. And so, some good things about those other attachment styles beyond fearful, secure, is that anxious avoidants are very independent. They're very self-reliant. And that's seen as a really positive thing in Western culture, right? Like we like people who are self-starters, who are go-getters, who are problem solvers, who can tackle things on their own and are self-sufficient and don't need a lot of help. We see that as an admirable trait. And so a lot of times, really functional, really professionally successful, really efficient, productive people are actually anxious avoidant. And we know that our anxious ambivalents are seen as super giving partners. They can be incredibly nurturing to the people that they care about. Anxious ambivalent people tend to invest a lot of time and energy in their important relationships. So that looks like their romantic relationships, but also in their friendships, that these are the people that would bend over backwards and give you the shirt off their own back. If they thought you needed it, if they thought it would help you, they would expect nothing in return, because what is most gratifying to an anxious ambivalent person is your friendship or your love. That closeness and that intimacy is inherently rewarding to them. And so it can be wonderful if you have an anxious ambivalent person in your life. It can become a little smothering. They might not know when to stop giving all of the love, but who dislikes being cared about, and being helped, with no expectation of anything in return but your presence in their life. I mean, that's a that's a lovely thing. Secures do tend to have better relational quality generally, but that is a general trend, and attachment might be only one facet to that larger story. And I just want to note that we want to avoid playing the blame game. So if you feel like you are not securely attached, remember that your parents might not have had good role models themselves. They might not have had the resources at the time to be consistently responsive in the best way. They might have been extremely attached themselves. Remember major life events like a death in the family, divorce, financial insecurity, threat of crime, including the parent's own attachment style, can play a really important role in how they understand how to best be a parent. And so, a lot of times, people doing their best, trying their hardest to be a wonderful parent, can still produce an anxious, ambivalent child, right? Because they might have loved a little too much. If they had a highly neurotic parent, then they can't help but be smothering and create an anxious, ambivalent attachment in their child sometimes. So it's important not to play the blame game, and remember that a very well-intentioned and loving parents can sometimes still produce a child that is not securely attached. Attachment is seen as a lifelong construct, so most people, the attachment style that they learn in infancy stays with them the rest of their lives from cradle to grave. However, there are instances where someone's attachment style could change across the lifespan. And so here are some explanations for that change. Sometimes a really major event, a very significant event, can change a person's worldview. And so, divorce, marriage, reunion after a long separation, death of a loved one, these things can be so profoundly life altering, can be such a shock to the system, that a person's attachment can shift. The way that they have relational fears, or the way they see themselves and others, can change. You know, one area where we have a lot of empirical data is in the event of a divorce. So securely attached people who go through a divorce that is traumatic, that is very contentious, sometimes a divorce that they did not anticipate, like in the case of infidelity, or a young widowhood. So if a person's partner dies young, the loss of that marriage and that relationship can deeply, profoundly shift the way a person sees the world. And so we have seen in the data that even like if a securely attached person goes through a kind of traumatic loss of relationship like that, they can become anxiously attached for a while. And so they might become dismissive, or they might become preoccupied. It can go in either direction. Um, your attachment style can also be influenced by your partner's style. So especially if we think about, let's look at an anxious avoidant person. They have that negative mental model of themselves, but a positive model of other people. Let's say that they wind up falling in love with and getting married to a securely attached person who gives them consistent love and affection, approval, reassurance over many years, with that loving care and attention, with that constant reinforcement of I like you, I choose you, the more I get to know you, the better I feel about you. That kind of approval from their partner can over time diminish their fears of abandonment. The anxious ambivalent person might come to know and trust that their partner isn't going to leave them, that they are not searching the environment for a better option or an alternative, that they are in it for life. And so we can see that, that anxious ambivalent person over time becomes less and less afraid, has less and less fears of abandonment, and they kind of like can sidle into that secure box, because they're just not afraid that their partner is going to leave them. And that is because of the steady, consistent responsiveness of their partner's style. We can also see that different attachment styles might depend on the relationship type. So that's kind of the scenario. What I just described with that anxious ambivalent person over time becoming secure, we would call that earned secure, that their relational fears shift and they can become secure. And that can be true for anxious avoidant people as well. If they meet the right person who is the right fit over time, they might become less afraid of being close to them. Now, these changes, what we would call attachment instability, are not typical. It is not typical. Most people, they are what they are their whole lives, and that's just it. But we know that there is a bit of an individual difference. In terms of personality characteristics, some people just don't change a lot, whereas other people do. So some people, just generally speaking, are more susceptible to change than others. And so if we have a person that is very changeable, their attachment style could shift over time depending on what experiences happen with their various relational partners. And the good news is that typically when we see the change, the instability happen for secure people, like that example I gave off the top, if a secure person went through a really traumatic divorce or death, they could move into a more fearful category, like anxious ambivalent or anxious avoidant. Generally, what we see is if there's not another instance of trauma, that secures will boomerang back, that like secure people's resting state is secure. And so even if they spend a little while being more fearful of intimacy or abandonment, they tend to return to that kind of secure state over time. And that's good news. So based off of what you know, who would you say is most comfortable with self-disclosure in terms of attachment style? What we know from the data is that those who are most comfortable with self-disclosure are securely attached people. They believe that they're lovable. They say, hey, I've received attention all my life, and when I share things about myself, I receive acceptance. And so I feel comfortable sharing things. I'm a good person and my partner will stay with me. And if they don't accept me for who I am and what I have to say, then they're not the right fit and I'll move on and I'll be fine. Who is the least comfortable with self-disclosure? It is our anxious ambivalence. You might have thought it was our anxious avoidance, like people that don't want to get close. But actually, remember, anxious avoidants have a positive view of themselves and they have a low fear of abandonment. So they're fine with sharing information about themselves. Like, take it or leave it. I think I'm awesome. It's actually our anxious ambivalents who have a positive view of other people, but a negative view of themselves, that are afraid to tell the honest truth about themselves. They have a low self-worth and they don't want to disclose any negative information about themselves past a certain extent because they fear that if their partner really knows them and sees them for who they are, they will leave them. They will realize that they're not good enough and they will leave them. Who feels strongly about formal commitments? Probably will not surprise you. Anxious, ambivalence are preoccupied. They need formal commitment the most. They need a label. Am I your girlfriend? Am I your boyfriend? Are we seeing other people? Let's make it Facebook official. I want my photo in your profile on social media. Dismissives or anxious avoidance desire it the least. We don't need to put a label on it. I don't believe in labels. Anxious avoidance are also people that would probably question the nature of monogamy in general. Um, Social support, being there for others. We know that our secures are best at it. Anxious avoidance are really good at low stakes crises because they're capable, they know how to handle things because they've always had to take care of themselves, so they're good with the small stuff. But the big stuff, they feel like, whoa, this is too much, this is too intimate, you rely on me too much, and they want to bail. And one of the reasons why we would say our secures are the best at social support because our anxious ambivalence are probably the most willing to give support, but what we see is that they can get over involved. So the anxious ambivalent person, if their friend is going through something, they might, or their romantic partner, they're going to like ask a ton of questions. They're going to check in a lot. They might get, overly involved in terms of social support. They will kind of take it on as their own thing. Like, hey, I am here with you. I am going through it just as much as you are. Did you take my advice? Did you call this person? What can I do today? And it can be too much. And so while anxious ambivalents are the most willing to give social support, they're not always the best at it. Secures tend to be better at spotting, like, okay, when to get involved, when to pull back, when to mind their own business. Who would you guess is the most jealous? It is our anxious ambivalence. They're afraid their partner will leave them. And so, well, actually, if we had to, I mean, if theoretically we would say that our fearfuls are probably the most jealous, but we don't have the data. We don't know. So we know that our anxious ambivalence get jealous of other people, that other people are always seen as threats because they believe that other people are good and that they themselves are bad. And so it's only a matter of time before a genuinely better option comes along for their romantic partner, or it's only a matter of time before their romantic partner realizes that like they're not good enough. And so it's when they're in relationships, it's very much as a kind of imposter syndrome, like there is a ticking clock on this. As soon as they get to know the real me, they're going to bail. They're going to realize like they could do better than me, and they'll move on. And so they do way more surveillance behaviors, checking phones, stalking them on social media, looking through texts, asking about people at work. Whereas our anxious avoidance, they expect the relationship to end anyway. So it's way less jealousy. And in fact, they might be the person that's like, yeah, you should go sow your wild oats, explore your options. I don't care. Um, Interestingly, our anxious ambivalents are also the people that are most likely to kind of set up the next relationship while they're in one. So even though they're like totally obsessed with their partner and they need constant reassurance and they're super into them, they believe that eventually their partner will leave them, and they understand that they need a relationship to function. And so a lot of times it's actually kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The anxious ambivalent person will like have the next person lined up and waiting in the wings for when their relationship eventually implodes. And the way that they behave kind of leads to the demise of that relationship by being clingy, by being jealous, by being controlling. But when their partner does eventually leave them, thus affirming their mental working models of themselves and others and their fears of abandonment, they have the next person ready to go, lined up. And so they jump right into the next relationship. A lot of serial monogamists are actually probably anxious, ambivalent people. And lastly, attributions, the way we explain people's behavior. We know that secure people give their partners the benefit of the doubt when something goes wrong. They try to find a reason why they could have done something bad without intending to, or without understanding the scope of the bad thing. Dismissives always, or anxious avoidance, always make negative attributions. So they expect other people to let them down. And it's easy to find an instance where the person does let them down. Oh, you're 5 minutes late to our date. Well, figures, people suck. You don't care about me. I didn't think you would. And so you're a waste of my time. Preoccupieds or anxious ambivalence um, also tend to make negative attributions because they make distress maintaining attributions. Like they're always scanning the environment for threats. They think their partner is going to leave them. And so they're always looking around for if their partner is losing interest, if their partner is interested in someone else. And so they kind of can create a situation where they push their partner out the door with their constant surveillance, which is a sad thing for our anxious ambivalent people because they're afraid of that happening and then they sort of make it happen. So we know that securely attached people do tend to have the best relational outcomes in terms of having satisfying and happy relationships. The way that they're supportive of their partner, giving their partners a break if they screw up. And so it seems like everyone must want to date a secure person, right? Like that seems logical. If they're the most supportive, if they're the most reasonable, if they tend to have the best relationships, we all must want that, right? Well, I mean, look around in your own romantic history and your friends and family. We know that people make strange choices for themselves. And so people do not always pursue relationships with secure people. One of the reasons we can explain people going after or staying in relationships that make us scratch our heads, why is he going out with her? Or why is she putting up with that? Why is he so obsessed with him when this is going on, right? Like we've all looked around and asked these questions, or why did I do that myself? The theoretical explanation that attachment theory would offer is the reinforcement effect, that it proposes that people don't want to date the person that will treat them the best. People want to date the person that confirms their own attachment style. So people communicate in cycles that reinforce their attachment style. Securely attached people do, in fact, seek out relationships with other securely attached people. But our anxious ambivalent people, or preoccupieds, have negative self-worth and believe that they aren't worth staying in a relationship with, or that there are better alternatives than them. They might say like, I'm good. I mean, I'm okay, but there are better people out there. And so what we see is a lot of times anxious ambivalent people seek out relationships with anxious avoidant people, dismissives, who leave them or who are emotionally unavailable to them, because the anxious ambivalent person is trying desperately to get closer and closer. They just want to get closer. They want more approval. They want more reassurance, and they don't believe they actually deserve it. And the dismissive or anxious avoidant person confirms this self view. They are emotionally unavailable to them, and this is like crack to the anxious ambivalent person. It's like the common trope or narrative about like nice guys finishing last. Well, it would say anxious ambivalent people don't want to be with a secure person. They want to be with someone that they have to chase and chase and chase and chase and chase. And it makes sense to them if they can never catch them, because they ultimately and in their heart don't believe that they should be able to. We know that our anxious avoidant people, they feel good about themselves, but they want distance from other people. So they like to be in relationships with other anxious avoidant people, because then they're giving each other plenty of space. But they also like to be in relationships with secure people, because secure people can handle more autonomy. They're more independent. And so anxious avoidant people want their positive self-worth confirmed. They like to feel desired. They like this is one of the reasons why they will date an anxious ambivalent person, because they enjoy being chased. They like the attention. But when it comes down to it, they don't want to get that close. And so that clinginess, that neediness, that desire to be emotionally intimate is a turnoff. And so what we see is anxious, avoidant people, if the secure wants to get too close, they will drop them. And our poor fearfuls, we're not sure. We don't have enough data to really say, but we are guessing that they swing between desiring intense closeness to extreme distance. So these are people that might get married in Vegas after meeting someone for one day, but then annul it the next day and disappear. Um, and that's obviously like an outrageous example, but we're not sure what our fearfuls do. We are guessing that they bounce between extremes of like getting super intense, moving in, falling in love, like love at first sight, really madly intense, but that it burns out super quickly. And they might go so far as to like move to a new town, change their phone number, like try like completely disappear because that closeness was terrifying. And so our fearfuls, we're not sure, but that is our best guess as theorists as to what their adult romantic relationship behavior might be. So that wraps up the lecture on attachment as love. Check out the rest of the materials, especially that strange situation video in our Blackboard page.